Okay, here we go. Thank you for your attention. And you have gotten immersed in probably as much you ever want to hear about parental alienation in one day. And I'm glad of that. I'm glad that you've studied your way through this and you've gotten a lot of information. And I am going to take a slightly different approach because, now that you've learned about it, you probably say, well, this all makes sense. I'm a believer, at least to some extent. I think this really happens. It's a serious problem for many, many families, and so on and so on. But as I mentioned earlier, there are people in our community who are not believers in this. Now, I'm not talking about people who just have different opinions. Like I mentioned a couple of people this morning who think about it a little differently. There are different tracks, there are different kind of themes that different people want to stress. I'm not talking about people who just have different opinions, since in medicine and in psychology and everything, people have different opinions. There are few people, this is really, to me, it's an interesting phenomenon. There are a few people who believe that parental alienation doesn't exist at all. They're kind of fanatical about it, but these people are very outspoken. And I'm going to tell you who some of them are. They're not secret. I mean, they have websites to this effect, and they testify in court to this effect, and they write articles for law journals. And in other words, it's kind of amazing that there are few, and it's a small number of people, but they're very vocal. And I want to tell you about them because if you hear them in the community, you may wonder what's going on here. And as you may have noticed this morning that I'm kind of into this topic, and maybe I get a little wound up some of the time, but when I'm talking about this afternoon, I'm even more likely to get wound up because I've been confronted by some of these people. Like in a court case, I might testify, and then there's a surprise witness comes in that afternoon who testifies that Dr. Burnett is totally out in left field. There is no such thing. And the phrase that they use sometimes is that it's a hoax, that parental alienation was a hoax invented in 1985 by Richard Gardner. And why would they say this? They say Gardner was an advocate for dads, and especially for dads who committed domestic violence and who abused their children and who sexually abused their children. And that these dads want their children so they can abuse them even more. And that's why Dr. Gardner invented this concept of parental alienation so that abusive dads can get their children back and abuse them even more. And now that may sound far-fetched to you, but people have actually said this, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples where people have actually published that opinion. So, and this is different from other controversies in psychology. I guess I mentioned this morning, there's controversies about autism. There's controversies about basic things, how to treat schizophrenia, for instance. But this controversy is really far-fetched because the extreme skeptics seem just to be in a different world when they say that this doesn't even exist. So first of all, let me explain. So this is the topic. So I'm going to talk about disinformation and memes. I'm going to explain what a meme is. And then there are three forms of fake news that I'm going to address. The first one is parental alienation is junk science. That's said over and over and over again. The second one is PA has not been recognized by professional organizations. That is a junk science, that is a fake news statement that is said over and over again, that PA has not been recognized, and that is an untrue statement. And the third one I'm going to discuss is the fake news, there is no empirical research. So first of all, let me tell you a little bit about kind of the underlying science to fake news. And it involves this man whose name is Richard Dawkins. You may have heard of him. He doesn't have anything to do with parental alienation. He was he's a genetics person. And he wrote this book 30 years ago called The Selfish Gene. And it's all about genetics. But the idea doesn't have anything to do with our topic, but the idea was that, as you know, in evolution, organisms like animals or plants compete, and the more successful ones propagate themselves as organisms. And his idea was that genes, in some circumstances, not just the whole organism, but individual genes are geared up to propagate so that they will be more successful and have, in a sense, descendants. Well, in this book, he introduced a term called the meme, the M-E-M-E. And it's sort of added on at the end of the book, in the last chapter of the book, he has a chapter on memes. And so he introduced this idea. Put on the next slide. This is the definition. A meme is a concept or catchphrase which spreads from person to person via social networks, news sources, or professional journals. It's similar to a fad or a craze. So the idea is that a gene is a physical piece of biology that replicates itself. And a meme is something that exists in a society that's verbal usually, or musical, or something that can be communicated that replicates itself. And a meme takes on a life of its own and continues on and on. Now, I'm telling you all this because we're talking about fake news. Why does fake news get propagated? And people have actually studied this, that there's kind of an underlying science. And believe it or not, there's a whole team of people at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And a couple months ago, they published a paper on that exact thing. Why is it that false information, fake news, gets propagated through social media? And they studied it, and whatever people at MIT do, and at a minimum, they validated what we all know, that certain statements, especially false statements, get propagated through social media. So I'm telling you this because I think that these three things that I'm going to address are examples of how this works. So the first one is a meme that says parental alienation is junk science. And in the next slide summarizes a little bit of the history of this specific phrase. So isn't that a catchy phrase? Parental alienation is junk science. As far as I can tell, this person named Paul Fink first said that in 2003, and he was being interviewed by somebody for some kind of online publication. And then he restated it in 2010 in a journal called Clinical Psychiatry News. He said PAS was junk science invented by a psychiatrist. A couple years ago, Newsweek magazine quoted him that he called PAS junk science at its worst. And recently there was something from Israel that said the same thing. So, next slide. So who is this guy, Paul Fink, who keeps saying this over and over again? He's a very famous psychiatrist. That's what's so bothersome. Paul Fink was the president of the American Psychiatric Association. And he also writes this column in back of me, which is called Fink, Still at Large, and it was for this magazine called Clinical Psychiatry News, which is it's not really a journal, it's kind of like a monthly newspaper for psychiatrists. And in the next little beep here is what he said in this particular issue a couple years ago. This stuff is egregious, so we're going to read this together. He's talking about DSM-5, his opinion about what should go in DSM-5. And he's talking about things that should not go in DSM-5. And he says, one such area is parental alienation syndrome. I am personally involved in opposing the inclusion of this bit of junk science invented by a psychiatrist in the 1980s, the late Dr. Richard A. Gardner. So that's what he's expressing. This is his opinion that PA should not have been included in the DSM-5. So that's okay, that's his opinion, I suppose. But he says that he's taken this on as a personal mission. Next slide is a little additional thing he said. And he's talking about people who have been advocating, including me, that PA should be in DSM-5. He says, in recent years, the ball has been picked up by fathers' rights groups who don't like to be interfered with when they are sexually abusing their children. This group has petitioned the DSM task force to include PAS in the publication. So that's what I said a minute ago, that these skeptics claim that the concept of parental alienation is being pushed by abusive fathers who want to get their kids back so they can abuse them even more. Now, this is the president of the American Psychiatric Association saying this. Well, you know, I get this little journal, and I read this, and I got the word out to some of my friends, and we wrote in letters to the editor, and many people did. Some people that I got the word to, but other people I didn't even know sent letters to the editor. So I'm kind of giving you the follow-up, that this is an example of fake news by this guy, and we objected to it, and he recanted. We forced him to take it back. So we sent in letters complaining. In fact, I sent in a letter saying that he's suggesting, I'm the guy who's pushing this DSM-5 thing, and he's accusing me of abusing my children. And I said, I understand that he didn't really mean literally me, but it sounded like it. But anyway, the very next issue, in the next slide, he was forced, the editors, I think, made him issue an apology. And this is the first thing he said in the next doodad here. He replies, I apologize for suggesting that all fathers who accuse mothers of PAS are sexually abusing their children. That was clearly an overstatement that I retract. And then again, he had to apologize 2 or 3 times in the same issue. I do not deny that parental alienation occurs and that a lot of people are hurt when there is an alienator. So I thought that had a somewhat happy ending, and that this was an extreme false statement that he made in a psychiatric publication, and within a month, I think within a month or maybe 2 months, he had to retract it. Now, but you gotta, I said this is a meme. So this idea that PAS is junk science did not end with Dr. Fink's retraction of his own statement. It's continued because it has taken on a life of its own. So in the next slide, there are several people who have said this, and I'm going to show them to you individually. But Carol Brooke, if I recall, is a law professor somewhere. Rebecca Thomas and James Richardson is an article in an important journal called the Judge's Journal. I don't know if any of the judges here read the Judge's Journal, but it was there. And then this lady named Holly Smith said this thing, this note proposes that parties involved in child custody disputes should be educated on the junk science of PAS. But in the next slide is this article by Carol Brooke, Parental Alienation Syndrome, Junk Science in Child Custody Determinations. In other words, my point is that this phrase, parental alienation is junk science, keeps repeating itself because now it's this part of what people say who don't like this idea. The next one is this journal called the Judge's Journal. And some of us were invited to submit articles for a particular issue having to do something about evidence in court, or I forget the general topic. But in the next thing is an article about junk science, parental alienation syndrome and junk science. But I was invited to write an article for the same issue. And so we ended up having both sides in the very same issue. And the next thing is what I wrote. parental alienation, misinformation versus facts. So, as you can see, I have really got involved in these projects of trying to beat down basically the misinformation and disinformation that is propagated regarding this topic. Oh, I think there's one more having to do with junk science. This is from I forget where I found this, but this is actually apparently just a couple of months ago, 2018, from some TV station in California. So first they said the movement to raise awareness about the dangers of parental alienation is growing on social media, which it is. We're here, and we talk about it a lot, and at conferences around the world. But then they said, but according to advocates for victims of domestic violence and child abuse, like Kathleen Russell, she's this lady from California, parental alienation is junk science. So that actually illustrates something, because there is friction between the people who are really, really concerned about domestic violence and the people who are really, really concerned about parental alienation. And there are people who are maybe even fanatically concerned about domestic violence, and they say that the parental alienation thing simply doesn't even exist, or it's a fraud. And what I've said several times, and I try to make this point, that domestic violence really exists. It's a real problem. It's an extremely serious problem. But sometimes there are false allegations of domestic violence. And then I say, parental alienation really exists. It's a real problem. It affects hundreds or thousands of families. But I would agree that sometimes there are false allegations of parental alienation. So the people who are on either side of this discussion, they shouldn't spend all day long arguing about which one is worse or who makes more false claims and whatever. I mean, they should sit down and they should try to figure out, well, how do you tell the difference? If you have a case in front of you and one member is accusing the other member of domestic violence or something like that, and the other one is accusing what Eric said, if parent A is saying that parent B acts in domestic violence, and parent B says that parent A is simply perpetrating parental alienation, that happens. Well, how do you tell the difference? How do you sort it out? If you want to put your energy into this, help figure out how to solve this. And the solution is not to say that one doesn't exist. The solution is try to do research on how do you tell the difference. So that's my first meme, which was PA is junk science. Is there any comment on that before we head on to the next one? Thank you. That's okay. Yes, sir.
I know some people whose lives have been impacted by domestic violence really, really, really horrible ways. And I have to say, if my life was impacted like theirs were, my thinking and my feeling would be formed by that belief.
Yes.
And it's like I can't say that I disagree with their position. It's kind of wrong in a way, but their world is shattered. The other thing I want to say is that in those cases, it's something like maybe 30% or so, no one knows for sure, PA cases, there are allegations of domestic violence coexisting with the allegations of PA. Okay, so when I said in a case like that, it's kind of like A or B. It's either domestic violence or it's PA, and no one's really quite sure. The best I can tell, it's really, really, really hard to tell the difference. And the one person's false positives or the other person's false negatives. It's a real mess. It seems like to me we need to come up with some way to deal with this that's more robust, where we can handle ambiguity we don't have the ability to distinguish between them.
Right. So I think you all heard most of that, which is that both DV and PA are serious issues, and it really is hard in some cases to tell the difference when it's presented. And there are obviously there are many cases where both things come up at the same time. It's not always the case. Sometimes it's one or the other, and it's easier to identify. People have tried to develop protocols for how you tell the difference between a true and false allegation of DV and a true and false allegation of PA. I can't really go into the whole details here, but I'll just tell you, in general, you do like you do with any medical diagnosis. If you're not sure whether somebody has this or that, you collect data and you try to figure out, is this, sometimes schizophrenia is confused with bipolar, just as an example. So you collect data and what are the symptoms that might be consistent with schizophrenia and what are the symptoms that might be consistent with bipolar disorder? And eventually one of them is much stronger than the other. Well, that's what you do in these cases. You collect data, what is more consistent with domestic violence in this case, and you try to collect information from a lot of different places. What is more consistent with parental alienation? And usually you can collect data that helps you make a decision. Let me tell you about the next meme, which is PA has not been recognized by professional organizations. And for those of you who are not attorneys, let me explain why that's important sometimes. Because sometimes in order to present a case about parental alienation, you have to do what's called a Daubert test. A Daubert test is a legal test in which you prove that what you're about to talk about is scientific. And one way you prove that it's scientific is that it's been accepted by the relevant professional organizations. In other words, you can prove that schizophrenia is scientific by showing that that concept of schizophrenia has been accepted by the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Medical Association, and so on. So that's why this is a particularly interesting meme when they say PA has not been recognized. They say that over and over again. In fact, here, let me give you some examples of who says that. This guy, Peter Jaffe, has said that. He said, although PAS has not been recognized by any major mental health or legal association, it has infiltrated the family justice system. That is untrue, that it has not been recognized. I mean, that's what I'm talking about, disinformation. And Jennifer Holt, 10 years ago, said, PAS lacks any indicia of general acceptance by major medical institutions, making it inadmissible. So Jennifer Holt is also an attorney. I think she's a law professor somewhere. And she makes these false statements. That was 12 years ago. I want to point out that this is still going on. That a couple weeks ago, Jennifer Holt, the very same lady, made a presentation for the Federal Bar Association. This is an advertisement for continuing legal education by this same lady. And one of the things she's talking about is, it's all about parental alienation, its current status in the fields of psychology and psychiatry, and evaluation of its evidentiary admissibility. That's what we're talking about here, is can you testify about parental alienation, and if you have to indicate that it's been accepted by the relevant scientific community. And she says it isn't, and that is untrue. And I'm going to give you some examples of where it's been recognized. Like in the next one is an organization that I'm real active in. This is the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. So this is the American Society for Child Psychiatrists. And these are also chronological, by the way. So this is maybe the first published document in the 1997 in which parental alienation was officially recognized by an organization. Yes, sir?
Is there a distinction between PAS and PA? So the last person was criticizing PAS, this person is describing PA. Is there a demonstrable difference?
Okay, so that seems like a very simple question. Is there a difference between parental alienation syndrome and parental alienation? And the answer is that historically, different people have used those words for different things. But contemporary, current day writers essentially say they're the same thing. In other words, this guy Richard Gardner used the phrase parental alienation syndrome. There was a big to-do about his using the word syndrome, because that's sort of a term of art in diagnostic lingo. And so most of us don't want to get into a fight over that word, so most of us simply use parental alienation to mean what Gardner used, parental alienation syndrome. Most of us simply say PA is the same as PAS, or almost the same, maybe in nuance of difference. Now, there are other people who use those words in different ways, but in general, almost always, most people nowadays, when they say PA, they simply mean the same thing that Gardner meant when he said PAS. But in any case, in this document, which is called an AACAP official action, which is how to do a custody evaluation, it actually has a section, and the heading of the section is parental alienation. And it talks about it here. There are times in a custody dispute, and so it kind of describes parental alienation. And the next slide, I think, does the same thing. It refers to that there are times during a custody dispute when a child can become extremely hostile toward one of the parents. So this is a very simple example where the leading association of child psychiatrists in this country actually has an official document that talks about parental alienation. Now, I'm going to give you several of these, but what I'm trying to do is to show you that there are people say there aren't any. They say this over and over again, but it's untrue what they say, and you just can't believe everything you hear. Let's see. So that's the AACAP, and the next slide is another organization, which is also very important, this is the AFCC, which is the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, and they also published a document called Model Standards for Child Custody Evaluation. And they also acknowledge the reality of parental alienation. In the next slide, this is what they say. Areas of additional specialized training include the assessment of children's resistance to spending time with a parent or parent figure, and allegations of attempts to alienate children from a parent figure, or significant other. Well, as you've learned today, to the point that you're probably fed up with it, that's the definition of parental alienation. And this is a really important organization, the AFCC, which is an organization of legal people, attorneys, judges, and mental health people who are concerned about divorce. So here's one more. I mentioned earlier today DSM a number of times. And then I also mentioned ICD. If you recall, ICD is the diagnostic list that's put out by the World Health Organization. It's called the International Classification of Diseases. And they are publishing a new edition, DSM 11, ICD 11, should come out any month now. And this is what it says in the next slide. So they have a diagnosis called caregiver-child relationship problem. And the DSM actually has a very similar thing. You're familiar with the thing called parent-child relationship problem. It's the same thing, except in this different book. And sure enough, under this diagnosis, they have synonyms, what they call index terms, and under the synonyms, they have parental alienation and parental estrangement. And you all recall that one is realistic refusal and the other is unrealistic refusal to see the other parent. And either one of those could present as this condition that they call caregiver-child relationship problem. So what's the moral here? They didn't think that parental alienation should be a diagnosis with its own number, but they agreed that it is an example of an actual diagnosis. So all I can say is the World Health Organization is, as far as we know, is including the words parental alienation in the next edition, which should come out soon. So that's another health organization that I think accepts the reality of this condition. So here's another one. This says the APA handbook. This refers to the American Psychological Association. They publish books. They publish lots of books. And they actually have a series of books that are the official handbooks, the APA handbooks in psychology. So these are edited, they're selected and edited by people who are actually the official representatives of the American Psychological Association. They're not just books that I would send in. They're actually books put out by the APA. And one of their books, handbooks, is on forensic psychology. And in this book is, next, a chapter called Child Custody and Access. And these two people, Mark Ackerman and this Jonathan Gould, they're very prominent members of the APA who write about child custody all the time. And sure enough, in their chapter, they have several pages on child alienation. And they discuss the different things that we've already talked about today. So that's a really good example where an official book put out by the APA, oh, this is what it says in the next, let's see, that's what I just said. This book, this handbook, has a section, Child Alienation, and it talks about the people I've already mentioned, Wallerstein, Gardner, Kelly and Johnston, so on. So that's a pretty good endorsement. Here's another one. In other words, I'm telling you, these big organizations endorse the reality of this condition. And that is flatly what these other people misstate. They're telling an untruth when they say it's never been accepted by a professional organization in the United States. How about this one? Oh, this is the organization I mentioned this morning, that the APSAC, Association, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. They're the people who publish this journal called Child Maltreatment, and this morning I gave you an example of this protocol that they developed, but this is a different one. This is a position paper on allegations of child maltreatment and so on in divorce situations. And they actually say this: if interpersonal violence is determined unlikely, one possible explanation for the false allegation, this is if domestic violence has been alleged and it's not a true allegation, an explanation may be an attempt to alienate the child from a parent. And they go ahead and say, such indoctrination is a form of psychological maltreatment. So that's another organization. In other words, if I were in court and I were trying to prove in a Daubert hearing, this is the simplest way to do it. That the concept is accepted by the relevant professional community, and I've given you several different organizations that do that. So here's a couple of other kinds of examples. This is an encyclopedia published only a couple years ago. And this is the beginning of the article. And in the history of parental alienation, it actually says the same thing that I told you this morning. This article by Westman, Wallerstein, Kopetsky, Clower and Rivlin, and Bricklin, and so on. And the reason why it says the same thing as what I told this morning is because I wrote this article for this encyclopedia. So I've learned a little bit about encyclopedias, that people, if you've published papers on something, and somebody's writing an encyclopedia, they contact you and they say, do you want to write something up for our encyclopedia that's coming out? And so that's kind of neat. I never knew that that's the way it happened, but I wrote this article. But in any case, that's what really is important, is that this is a book, an encyclopedia, published by a big publisher that includes this article. And there's one more in another encyclopedia. This is actually a different encyclopedia, and it has a similar article. So anyway, those are several ways to think about that it's accepted by organizations. So let me tell you one more thing. One more meme is this one, that people say there's no empirical research regarding parental alienation. Well, I'll tell you right up, people say that. Who says that? Let me give you an example of somebody who says that. And is this book right here? This problem is not from years ago. This is a current problem. This book was published in January. And these people, this Dr. Benjamin is the first author. And this is what he said, or this is what they said. In summary, there is no accepted theory or research supporting such a syndrome, nor the recommendations proposed. No, and then the bottom line is they say, no evaluator should base conclusions or recommendations on this approach. They're saying there's no research. Is that true? No, that's not true. And they're trying to get away with this. In fact, this is the book right here. I happened to see this by accident at a meeting a couple months ago in Memphis at the Peabody Hotel, and it's kind of a neat place to go to a meeting. And I came across this, and then I sent for it, and I found that there are 3 or 4 pages of outright false information in this book. And that's one of the sentences. I'm going to read you one more sentence. You can see why I'm all excited about this. This sentence actually misquotes me. And it flatly says the opposite of what my colleagues and I said. Now, they actually did give the correct reference to an article that my friends and I wrote in 2010. And then the sentence in front of that says that PAS assumes that a child's strong alignment with one parent while rejecting a relationship with the other parent is without legitimate justification. We don't assume that. Nobody would assume that. In other words, sometimes the rejection is alienation, but sometimes it's something else. We certainly don't assume that. And then it says, including situations in which there is child abuse. Well, we obviously don't think that in cases of child abuse that it's alienation. We would say that it's something else. It's estrangement. It's just amazing. This book quotes my article and says the exact opposite of what we said in the article. So, and there are 3 pages of this stuff. So what am I doing about this? As you see before, I've complained to newspaper editors and magazine editors, and so we're writing up a complaint to the people, to the APA who published this book, the American Psychological Association. We're asking that the book be withdrawn from publication until that can be corrected. I mean, there's a whole 3 pages of this stuff. I'm not going to read you all the examples. And I've already collected some signatures from several other members of the APA. If any of you belong to the American Psychological Association and you want to sign on to a complaint that's going to go to the APA in which we ask them to withdraw this book, let me know and I'll sign you up and you can join in this project. But my main thing I'm trying to say is that this kind of false information isn't over. You would have thought that after 30 years we would have worked through this, but it's still here.
Bill, like in this case that is quoting you, is it feasible to think that it's a mistake, or is it not feasible to think it's a mistake?
So Mr. Chan says maybe they are just making a mistake. Well, if they are, they're making 3 pages of mistakes. And I know that it isn't. I know the person who wrote these pages. I don't know him personally, but I know who he is, and I've seen what he's written. And he persistently makes false statements about parental alienation. He's very smart. He's the editor of a journal. I know he's familiar with the literature. So I'm assuming that he is purposefully saying things that are untrue. And that's even worse. You know, that's even worse than simply being stupid. It's being malicious. So,
That's a pretty unusual thing for an editor of a journal to purposely put things in that aren't true. I mean, it's not something that you typically see in life. Do you have any explanation at all for that?
well, Mr. Chance is wondering whether any of us can explain why the author of those pages is so adamantly opposed to parental alienation, and I don't know. I don't know his history. I don't know how he came to this position, but he's an example. I gave you several examples of people who are fanatically opposed to parental alienation, and he's one of those people. I don't know how he came to be there. Let me mention a couple of other things, and we're kind of winding down here. So the allegation is there's no research, but let me just explain that there is research. So I mentioned earlier that there's qualitative research, which is simply descriptive. And there are hundreds of articles from 38 countries that are descriptive of parental alienation. And I was in a meeting once with a bunch of psychologists who were being somewhat skeptical about whether it, how important and what is the evidence. They said, well, what is the research? What is the evidence? And I said, well, it's qualitative research. And they said, well, so what about that? And I said, well, there are 38 countries. I said, if there were entomologists who described the same butterfly in 38 countries, I think most people would accept that that butterfly really exists. I don't know, they didn't seem to like that argument particularly, but to me it seemed like a good argument. But anyway, that's qualitative descriptive research. There's also quantitative research. And some of you might know that we have this database. We've collected over 1,000 articles related to parental alienation. So this is on your handout. You can look this up if you want. My library at Vanderbilt let me do this. It's on their server. And you can go there and you can look up articles to your heart's content. But also, there is not as much quantitative research, but there is some. There may be 100, maybe a couple hundred quantitative. And there are people who have reviewed this topic who are not me and not my friends, but people I know. And the next slide summarizes what they said. Oh, actually, I guess I mentioned Warshak earlier today. He's a really good example of qualitative research because it's simply descriptive with no statistics. But anyway, the next one is this book. This is a kind of scientifically oriented book about divorce and child custody. And this has a chapter in it which reviews the research on parental alienation. So go to the next chapter. And this is what the chapter is called. And then this is what it says. So these people reviewed a number of quantitative research studies and just listened carefully to what they said. There's remarkable agreement about the behavioral strategies parents can use to potentially manipulate their children's feelings, blah, blah, blah. And the cluster of symptoms of behaviors indicating the presence of alienation in the child can also be reliably identified. In other words, what they're saying is, do you remember I said there are 8 symptoms of parental alienation, and there are 17 or 18 alienating behaviors. The symptoms are in the child, the alienating behaviors are in the parent, and they're saying, right here, that there's research supporting those factors. Now, there's still research to be done. Like what is the actual prevalence in different countries? Are there any psychological tests? I told you about one that I did, the PARQ, the P-A-R-Q. Are there other psychological tests that might help distinguish alienation and estrangement? Are there treatments that work? we haven't even talked about treatments today. So come back maybe some other day for that. Are there research on treatments? There is a little bit, but there needs to be more, and so on. So nobody's saying that the research portfolio is complete, but it certainly is substantial enough to prove the reality of parental alienation. So we've tried to cover a good deal of territory today. Let me mention this organization that we started a couple years ago, the Parental Alienation Study Group. So if any of you are interested in it, you're welcome to join this organization. What you do is you just go to it, go to the website, and on the website it says, do you want information or you want to contact us or something like that. And you fill that out and send it in, and that comes to me, and I will send you an email back explaining what you need to do if you want to be part of this organization. If you're interested in this topic, the main thing the organization does is it helps people stay in touch with each other. We kind of stay in touch about what are we doing, what are our projects. Sometimes we work together on a research project or something else. So thank you very much for being here today and participating. I think we have a couple of minutes if you all have a question or a comment. Or in any case, I think all of us who spoke this afternoon are going to be hanging out here for a little while. Thank you. Okay, y'all take care. Have a good weekend. Hi.
Attorney, if you have a severe case of parental alienation, what kind of recommendations are we seeing?
Yeah,
In custody,
let me tell you. Whenever I do this, I get a runny nose. Yeah, maybe that's it. Now, really severe are the kids who haven't even gone for a year or 2 years. They refuse to go. And secondly, the preferred parent is not helping it at all. The preferred parent is either oblivious or says, it's not up to me to make the children go. Anyway. So that would add up to severe. So we say...
I have a dad who, for example, knew that the court needed real evidence that the child didn't want to go, so he taught his daughter to cut herself.
I mean, that's horrible.
Isn't it?
I mean,
so when I say
that,
severe...
So we first of all, we tell the court, we said we would classify that as child abuse. It is the parent who is causing that to happen is child psychological abuse for all the reasons that we've explained. And we said, well, Your Honor, the usual solution for child abuse is to remove the child from that home, from the place where the abuse is happening. Well, at least for a while, at least until things can get changed. So we recommend that the child be removed. And typically the child should simply go to the other parent. Now, there are programs that are specifically designed to help children adjust to being with this new parent. And maybe you've heard of them. Family Bridges is the most famous one. And that guy Warshak started it years ago. He's not involved anymore. But if you Google Family Bridges, you'll get information about it. They've been around the longest. They've had maybe 160 kids go through it. So that must be 100 families with multiple kids, maybe 80 families, I don't know. Typically, the kids at the end of 4 days, it's a 4-day program,
4 days.
At some interesting place, because in evenings the kids and the dad go out and have dinner or go on a roller coaster or do something fun.
Okay.
The kids go home to the dad, and then there's an after program where the kids, but mainly the alienating parent, has to participate. Oh, and then there's no contact with the alienating parent for 90 days. So what the judge has to do, the judge has to give custody to the dad, at least temporary. He says the dad can enroll the children in this program, which presumably he'll do. The mom, you said it the other way around, actually, in your case, right? But in any case, the alienating parent has no contact for 90 days. And if she does contact the kids, the 90 days starts over again. In other words, it's very strict. And the alienating parent works with a coach, or an aftercare professional is what it's called, during that time, and hopefully she changes her behaviors. And at the end of the 90 days, there's another court hearing to decide what's going to happen then. So that's been used on hundreds of families. Family Bridges is not the only people who do that. There are 3 or 4 similar therapists or companies that do it. So it's kind of a proven intervention that the great majority of kids, at the end of the 4 days, 95%, they say, have adapted to being with this parent whom they previously hated. Most of them stay that way. There are some kids who relapse. The relapses are usually because the judge prematurely lets them have contact back with the other parent before the other parent has really changed sufficiently. So it's not perfect because not every single kid. Incidentally, the 95%, I mean, the one kid who doesn't is usually very unusual. In one case, that kid was 17 and a half years old, and she said, look, I'm not going to change my mind about anything. But my younger siblings can go, we'll all go. But, she told them, you're not, I'm out of here in a couple of months. And the other one that didn't work, they go to this program and they learn that the mother had died, that one of the alienating parent actually died during that 2 to 3 day interval. So so they sent the kid home. In other words, it ended. They didn't continue. It was a very unusual circumstance.
Yeah. Okay. And that was Family Bridges.
Family Bridges.
Okay.
Or War Shack. But he isn't involved anymore. He started it. But if you just Google Family Bridges, you'll find it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Good luck.